Good morning and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, and distinguished guests, to the representatives of the World Bank Group, North Sumatra's provincial government, West Java's provincial government, the Ministry of Transportation of the Republic of Indonesia, PLN, and also the representatives of other related ministries. Welcome to the second day of the workshop E-Mobility Adaptation Roadmap for Greater Bandung and Greater Medan Bus Rapid Transit Systems. Once again, my name is Sarah Wayne, and it's such an honor again for me to be the master of ceremony for today's workshop. The government of Indonesia, ladies and gentlemen, might I remind you, just like what we have discussed yesterday, has been continuously promoting the adoption of an e-mobility program for sustainable and clean transportation, and also the adoption of the e-mobility program for road transportation in Indonesia, which is expected to be able to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions by reducing the country's reliance on fossil fuels. Policies have been rolled out and have been issued by the government to accelerate this e-mobility program. And the public transit electrification is just one of the priorities of the Indonesian government to be able to accelerate the e-mobility adoption in our country. And yesterday, ladies and gentlemen, we have listened to the presentations and also had a wonderful discussion regarding the BRT electrification roadmap in Greater Medan and also in Greater Bandung. And as for the second day of our workshop, which is today, we will be continuing once more the presentations on the best practices from other countries on the use of e-mobility and mass transit systems. And we'll also continue to address the e-mobility policy gaps in our country, in Indonesia. And also we will discuss the implementation strategies and also business models to adopt e-mobility and mass transit systems in the selected cities. But before we start, ladies and gentlemen, please do allow me to explain and remind to you the house rules for all sessions of our workshop. As for the house rules during the workshop of the e-mobility adoption roadmap for Greater Bandung and Greater Medan bus rapid transit systems, please, when you do enter the workshop, please click join audio and remember to please mute your microphone and turn off your video when you are not speaking. And next, we would like you to also please access your Zoom for a stable internet network. And while you are speaking, please do make sure there is no background noise. And please avoid accessing this workshop nearby other users because it may cause echo or feedback noises. And if you do have any questions, please do type them down and write the questions directly in the chat box available. I would like to also inform you that the presentations and also the discussions will be delivered both in Bahasa Indonesia and also in English. Therefore, we also have an interpretation feature available for you to use. If you are joining us using a computer or a laptop, you may choose the interpretation icon on the bottom right corner of your screen. And then you may choose the language of your choice, which is English or Indonesia. And remember that you do not need to change the channel when speaking. And do not worry because the speaker and also the interpreter will be able to hear your voice. And next, ladies and gentlemen, if you are joining us from your mobile phones, you may find the option on the more icon on the bottom right of your screen. Please do once again choose the language of your choice and remember to choose to mute original audio and also done after selecting. And remember, ladies and gentlemen, to always keep your microphone on mute and also keep your video off when you are not speaking. And ladies and gentlemen, please note that to ensure the smooth running of the workshop, the host or co-host reserves the right to force and mute the audio of participants who are not speaking that may be unintentionally causing disruption to the workshop. This is to ensure that the audio of the speaker and interpreter remains clear at all times. Once again, we thank you for your cooperation and understanding in this matter. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the e-mobility adoption roadmap for Greater Bandung and Greater Medan Bus Rapid Transit Systems workshop will be divided into a few sessions, as you can see here. The first, we will be having the welcoming remarks. And then afterwards, we will also be having an opening session. And then we'll continue with presentations and also the discussion panel. Therefore, we would like to encourage your participation and also your ideas, which you can also share with us through the Zoom chat box to give your support regarding the presentations and topics discussed. So ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, we will start our workshop of the second day of our workshop by welcoming remarks. Therefore, I would like to invite Bapak Suharto, the Director of Road Transportation, the Director General of Land Transportation, Ministry of Transportation of Indonesia, to deliver his welcoming remarks for us today. Kepada Bapak Suharto, saya persilakan.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Honorable representatives from the ministries and institutions from the government, either from investment in Ministry or BKPM, Ministry of Finance, Ministry of ESDM, Bappenas, and also Ministry of Environment and Forestry, Ministry of Home Affairs, and Financial Services Authority, and the representative of the regional government, all the presenters, and all audience whom I cannot mention one by one. First of all, let us pray to the God Almighty this morning for his blessing, allowing us to continue the second day of the workshop about the road mobility adoption roadmap for Greater Bandung and Greater Medan bus rapid transit system. This is initiated by the World Bank and PDP, and of course, even though it is done virtually, hopefully it will give benefits to every one of us. Ladies and gentlemen, and all speakers, as we all know, that in the midterm development plan 2020-2024, the mass rapid transportation, in this case, is the improvement of mobility and accessibility in the urban area, becomes one of the important issues, and it becomes the attention from the Ministry of Transportation. In this case, is Directorate General of Land Transportation. We can also say that several aspects that encourage the Director General of Land Transportation in doing the improvement and in planning of the urban transportation. It relates with the energy consumption, that the use of personal vehicles, especially in the urban area, becomes one of the reasons in terms of the spending of the fuel, which is from fossil. And based on the study from the World Bank in 2019, there is approximately 2.2 million liters per day, which is wasted in Greater Jakarta and also in Medan Metropolitan, Bandung and Surabaya and Makassar. Economic aspect from this consumption, if it is not converted to finance, we have a lot of loss for about 70 trillion rupiah. And another disadvantage, another loss is about congestion in terms, addition to the wasted energy consumption. It is also concerning, in this case, is the time of the traveling, which is very high. So in 1 hour, approximately there is 2 or 3 people died on the road. So the issue of the accident is dominated by the vehicles, especially motorcycles. And second is the environmental issue, that transportation also contributes, the second highest contributors for greenhouse gas. So the Director General of Transportation has already issued the program of mass rapid transportation, which has been conducted in several cities such as Medan, Denpasar, Palembang, Solo, Yogyakarta, Makassar, and Banyumas. And especially Banyumas, that is just launched 2 weeks ago. The load factor is considered 9.63%, and this is the record for all of us in the BTS services in several cities that we served. And then the occupancy for the mass transportation in the urban area will reach several cities in Indonesia. We are optimistic that the policy that will be taken through this activity will eliminate the problems that I mentioned above, which relates to the connectivity and accessibility in urban area. Ladies and gentlemen, adjusting with the topic of the workshop, as mentioned earlier, that the mass rapid transport in the city is conducted to respond to the environmental issue, but in line with the time that the technology development is very significant to provide solutions in transportation system, and one of which is relating to the use of electrical vehicles. So the regulation that related with electrical vehicle system is already many, including the presidential decree, the regulation of the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources, ministerial decree from the Ministry of Transportation, and also the regulation of Ministry of Industry. So everything has already regulated about ecosystem of the EV. Based on the regulations that have been issued by the government relating to electrical vehicles, it can be said that it is necessary to have a collaboration between ministries and institutions, not only within Ministry of Transportation in terms of the provision of the electrical vehicles, but also there is the role of the other ministries, academicians, and other organizations. EV in the urban area is possible concerning the compliance aspect of the service and safety. So this aspect is not only relating to the electrical vehicles, but also other supporting infrastructures such as station of the charging station and the adjustment of the street that is served, and the anticipation of other constraints such as the resilience during the rainy season, which is because we often experience a downpour, and mass transportation is still in the trial step, and it is tried in Jakarta through Transjakarta, and its operation has not yet provided the certain lane because the operational and the station still needs some distance. In terms of the implementation of the EV in the mass city transportation in Bandung and Medan, it is expected that through this workshop, it can be assessed in more in-depth with our source persons in relating to the investment side and technology analysis side and the steps of the implementation. Ladies and gentlemen, as a conclusion, I'd like to send my high gratitude to the World Bank and ITDP, who has already conducted this workshop agenda. And of course, later, the government cannot work alone without support and the participation of all stakeholders in order to develop the city transportation system. So through the workshop, it is expected that there is an input and positive recommendations and some in-depth assessment about EV in the mass city transportation, which becomes the consideration in our foundation in developing the mass city transportation in the future. To end, and hope you have a productive workshop, and hope we can get the high benefit from this workshop, and it can be implemented in wherever you are. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Wabillahi taufiq wal hidayah. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you, Bapak Soeharto,
invite Ms. Nupur Gupta, the Senior Transport Specialist of the World Bank, to be able to deliver her opening remarks. To Ms. Gupta, the time and screen is yours.
Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum. A very good morning to all of you. I'm really happy to be here today as we come to the conclusion of this technical assistance work that has been ongoing. As you know, we have been preparing the Indonesian mass transit project, MASTRAN, along with the Ministry of Transport and our co-financing partner, AFD, which really seeks to help develop institutional capacity and assist with the launch of the Indonesian mass transit national program, which can assist a number of cities in the launch of mass transit systems, which, as Pa Soeharto rightly pointed out, is the need of the hour to alleviate the congestion and other negative externalities that we see in the Indonesian cities. And this, along with this institutional and capacity development agenda, is also the delivery of 2 demonstration bus rapid transit systems, one in Greater Bandung and the other in Greater Medan. As part of this, we were keen to explore clean and green options, which are always of interest, and given the high engagement and priority that the government of Indonesia accords the e-mobility agenda, we have launched this technical assistance with the support of POLO and SMAP trust funds, and you know, the very positive contributions of ITDP and ICCT, who have been supporting us in implementing this very valuable study. The whole idea was to be able to explore how, in practical terms, a roadmap could be created to facilitate the deployment of electric buses on the BRT systems in these 2 cities. So it was a very specific agenda to say that, given the context, what would be the best approach to deliver electric mobility in these 2 projects in the 2 cities. I must say, we have made very good progress. Yesterday's sessions covered a lot of the technical aspects, such as the routing, the depot locations and strategy adopted, the operators strategy adopted, and how that contributes to the development of charging strategies, to the development of the entire implementation strategy, and the decisions that we take along the way, how they have an impact on the costs of delivering the TCO, and that becomes really, in many ways, the decision maker in moving forward. We also heard about the energy situation and the grid analysis. The contributions of Pa Bob yesterday were very helpful in understanding that, in fact, from an energy viewpoint, both in West Java and North Sumatra, there is not any constraint to the launch of e-mobility on the BRT systems in both these cities. And then they're fully willing to collaborate with DGLT and the provincial governments in the implementation of these systems, which is extremely encouraging. Moving from the session yesterday, today the discussions will really focus on the policy and regulatory context around electric mobility and mass transit in particular. and how that could perhaps be tweaked to make it more conducive as we move forward. And within that backdrop, also the whole economics of electric mobility or electric buses, and how we need to start looking at that particular aspect, because there are likely, while on the one side you are able to move, advance the whole clean agenda in terms of reduced local emissions, pollutants, and the greenhouse gas emissions. On the other, there are still some financial impacts that need to be considered carefully, and how the discussions of yesterday can go a long way in reducing the financial impacts and gaps with existing fossil fuel vehicles. So this is a very important session today. I look forward to your active deliberations and contributions through the sessions, to make this far more meaningful, and that the final roadmap that is delivered incorporates all this valuable feedback. And I have to take the opportunity to really thank DGLT, the West Java and North Sumatra provinces, for their very enthusiastic engagement throughout this process. And based on the discussions of yesterday and today, I really am looking forward to taking this study to the next level, and grounding some of those recommendations in the two cities of Greater Bandung and Greater Medan. With that, thank you so much. Have a fruitful and productive workshop. Please, looking forward to this discussion and deliberation. Terima kasih.
Terima kasih juga, Ms. Gupta. Thank you, Ms. Gupta, for the wonderful opening and welcoming remarks for us all. As we will continue with our next agenda for today's second day of the workshop, which is the opening session, which will be delivered by Ms. Faila Sufa from ITDP Southeast Asia Director. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Ms. Faila Sufa.
Thank you, Sarah.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Bapak Suharto, the Director of Land Transportation of the Ministry of Transportation of Indonesia, Ibu Nupurgutta, Senior Transport Specialist from the World Bank Group, distinguished guests from the ministries, from the West Java and North Sumatra provincial government and city government, and distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Today is the second day of the e-mobility adoption roadmap for Greater Bandung and Greater Medan Bus Rapid Transit System Workshop. My name is Faila Sufa. I'm a Southeast Asia Director of ITDP. I'm representing our team from ICCT and also from ITDP. I would like to send my gratitude for your attendance who joined in participating in this series of workshops. Just now, Ibu Nupurgutta has already mentioned that in the first workshop, we have discussed technical issues. For example, the selection of the depot and the division of operator, the determining the capacity of the battery and the charging infrastructure. And yesterday, we also discussed the implementation phase, the calculation of the TCO, and the requirement needed. So one thing that is also important in this in today's agenda, we will discuss about policy and recommendation requires to accelerate the adoption of electric bus, especially in the implementation of BRT in Greater Medan and Greater Bandung. And there is also the discussion about environmental impact and financial and business model. As we all know that in the implementation, those three topics are very important to be prepared first. So number one, the discussion about the policy and recommendation and what supports that are needed will be discussed in the session after the session to accelerate the adoption of electricity bus, especially in Greater Bandung and Greater Medan. And then the policy, either it is the national policy or local policy, and also the support in the format of fiscal or incentive or non-fiscal support. And even though in this discussion, we always discuss about capex, and currently it is higher than the diesel bus price. But if we see the economic benefits, such as its impact to the environment and health, then implementation of the electricity bus will provide more positive economic impact. It will be explained further. And investment and also schema of the good business model will be delivered also here. So it is expected that the plan of the BRT implementation by using e-bus can run smoothly and can be sustainable. And with that, without further ado, let us listen the presentation which will be delivered by my colleague. And before the last session, there will be discussion panels with the source persons invited. That's all from me. Hope this workshop runs very smoothly. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you very much, Ibu Faila Sufa, for the opening session. And we will continue with the next agenda with our workshop session.
BRT electrification in Greater Medan and Greater Bandung. And we have with us three speakers today. Please do allow me to welcome and introduce briefly of each speaker. The first is Mr. Francisco Posada, the ICCT senior researcher, who will be presenting policy options and recommendations for e-mobility adoption for mass public transport in Indonesia. And our second speaker is Mr. Adi Triatmojo, ICCT research consultant, who will be presenting the topic on environmental impact of BRT electrification in Greater Bandung and Greater Medan. And next, we will also have Mr. Revi Petragradia, ITDP National Finance Specialist, who will be sharing the topic financial and proposed business models for e-mobility adoption in Greater Medan and Greater Bandung. Thank you to all the speakers for joining us for our second workshop day, and we will have a panel discussion after the presentations, which then will be moderated by Ms. Faila Sufa. Therefore, I once again invite you to participate by discussion by proposing your ideas through the Zoom chat box if you have any opinions regarding the topics discussed. And once again, I would like to kindly remind that the presentations will also be delivered in Bahasa and in English, and there is an interpretation feature available that you may use by clicking on the icon on the bottom right of your screen. And so without further ado, I would like to present the screen to our first speaker, Mr. Francisco Posada. But please do allow me to read Mr. Posada's short bio. Mr. Posada is currently Senior Researcher and Emerging Markets Cluster Coordinator with expertise in vehicle technology and policy. His work focuses on developing roadmaps for emerging markets in their quest towards electromobility and decarbonizing the transport sector, and also supporting governments on implementing the plans. He leads projects on real-world vehicle emissions, including the testing that sparked Dieselgate. Mr. Posada holds a BS in Mechanical Engineering and also a PhD in Mechanical Engineering from West Virginia University. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Francisco Posada. And Mr. Posada, your time and screen is yours. and we'd like to kindly remind you that you have 15 allocated minutes to present your presentation.
Thank you, Sarah, for that introduction. Let's go to the first slide, please. Let's go to the next one. The policy recommendations that we're presenting today are derived from an analysis of success stories from different countries with different levels of economic and industrial development that are currently the leaders in electromobility adoption implementation. And these are cities and countries that are not at the pilot stage. These are cities and countries that already are scaling up the adoption of electric buses. So a brief summary of these cases define two main groups. One with a strong top-down direct involvement from the national and regional government that includes monetary incentives to transit operators, mandates to shift the fleet to electric buses, mandates for manufacturers to offer electric buses to the market, and other type of measures. China, California, and India provide this type of significant monetary and strong regulatory packages to help address the financial risks to the electric bus operators. The other group, Chile and Colombia, do not have access to strong direct incentives for electric buses, but they change their traditional procurement and contract structure to make a business case out of the public transportation. They increase contract duration, preferential electricity tariffs, and other small changes that help develop these type of structures. They do not have strong direct monetary incentives that are provided directly to electric buses. So these are some of the examples where we gathered, the best practices in terms of policy development to advise the government of Indonesia. And this is the goal of my presentation, is to provide an overview of what the government has been doing as of today, the level of maturity in terms of policy development, and what can we in Indonesia learn from these global cases. Let's go to the next slide, please. I would like to bring attention to some recent events in terms of decarbonization of bus fleets around the globe. As shown in the map, the green zones, 7 countries, Austria, Cape Verde, Chile, Colombia, Denmark, New Zealand, and the Netherlands, and also the state of California in the US, have committed to 100% electrification of the bus transit fleets in the next coming years, between 2025 and 2030, 2040. So there is a strong push to electrify these fleets. More recently, and this is what I wanted to highlight at COP26, a global MOU was launched to accelerate the zero-emission medium and heavy-duty vehicle markets, also including buses, by setting a 100% zero-emission target, including new buses, by 2040. The countries that signed the global MOU were Austria, Canada, Chile, Denmark, Finland, Luxembourg, Netherlands, New Zealand, Norway, Scotland, Switzerland, Turkey, the UK, Uruguay, and Wales. So it's a growing list of countries that are committing to bring 100% buses to the market. Let's go to the next slide. So let's move from the global context to Indonesia. The government of Indonesia has already declared very ambitious targets on vehicle electrification for the next 5 to 10 years, including vehicle, domestic production goals for 2 and 3 wheelers that reach 30% by 2035. Passenger cars will be 20% by 2035. Battery electric buses have been announced as 90% electrification by 2030. Those are the goals. And as well, corresponding electric charging stations reaching 80,000 electric points by 2025. So these are sort of the general goals that the government has set up. The government also plays a pivotal role in setting up the regulations and programs that ensure the future growth of battery electric vehicle technology. Starting with the figure on the right, shows the Presidential Regulation 55/2019, which we all know, the acceleration program of battery electric vehicles for road transport, and a series of implementing regulations by the main ministries involved, starting with the coordinating Ministry of Maritime and Investment Affairs, who coordinates the EV regulatory agenda, the Ministry of Industry, who is in charge of developing the roadmap of automotive national industry, as well as technical regulations on EV manufacturing standards. And very key element is the domestic content levels and how to evaluate those things, those contents. The Ministry of Transportation assesses the regulatory agenda in public transportation. One of those is the By the Service program, and the technical regulation for EV deployment, which is critical, ensuring that the vehicles that are on the roads in Indonesia meet the certificates, the standards via certificates of conformity. The Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources, key in this process, of course, setting policies in the energy sector in support of these deployments in two key areas: charging infrastructure and electricity business development and sales. And of course, is coordinating closely with the national electric utility company, PLN, in the country. The Ministry of Finance, developing fiscal incentives that target supply as well as demand. In terms of supply, the investments in EV manufacturing, so all the fiscal incentives to bring investors to grow this manufacturing segment for EVs, components, and vehicles, and the creation also of tax incentives for consumers. The Ministry of Home Affairs has a role in terms of enabling local governments to enact local fiscal incentives and other tools. Ministry of Environment and Forestry is regulation of the electric vehicle waste, so basically the end of life of the battery, ensuring that that will not create more environmental issues. And BAPENAS as the planning and evaluation of electric vehicle policies. These are a very mature, let's say, set of regulations and actors that have been supporting the adoption of electric vehicles in the country. And now we move to the next, which is we took a look at the main, so we classified all these policies into different groups. The main, let's say, groups of policies that support electric vehicle adoption around the world. We have 5 main groups: direct incentives, indirect incentives, infrastructure development, electric vehicle mandates, and innovative business models. Those are sort of the core of the policy aspects to develop a healthy electric vehicle ecosystem. So the research team, performed an analysis in terms of what were the policies available, how they compare with the international best practices, to be able to identify, the gap analysis, what is missing, what are the missing pieces, what should be, as Nupur mentioned, what should be tweaked to accelerate, to achieve better results. In the first component, direct incentives. So we identify a couple of those. In terms of supply, the Ministry of Finance provide very strong industrial development fiscal incentives for investment in the country. In terms of demand, that was much reduced. The Ministry of Home Affairs, they have a vehicle transfer fee reduction for battery electric vehicles, enabling local governments to reduce these transfer fees in the Greater Jakarta, Bali, West Java, and East Java as well. We'll go through each of those. So I will skip the gap column, but I wanted to mention that as well. The transfer fee is actually quite a limited amount. It accounts from between 5 and 15% of the base price, and it varies a lot by the province. And actually only 4 provinces have adopted this type of incentive. So moving into indirect incentives, the current policies, we have the PR 55/2019 established, the regulatory pathway for non-fiscal indirect incentives. Those cover incentives that promote electric vehicle use. And what we found is basically that Bali is one of the few cases, few examples where there is a regulation in terms of preferential parking access for battery electric vehicles. Non-fiscal incentives are typically managed at the local level, and again, we only found very few examples of those, so we think that a more robust set of non-fiscal incentives are actually due in Indonesia, and the Ministry of Home Affairs could lead that regulatory development. In terms of infrastructure development, the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources has already identified technical regulations for charging stations and battery swap stations. So that's the core of the work. Also, as well as the pricing and business structure of this development. And it's already part of the development plan on the medium-term national development plan, the RPGMN 2020 to 2024. So that is very positive to see that already incorporated in paper. In terms of
the remaining time is 5 more minutes.
5 more minutes. Okay. In terms of public fleet vehicle mandates, unfortunately, there is none required. Transjakarta, however, has clear goals to reach 10,000 buses by 2030, and the MOT has expressed a goal of 90% electrification of the bus fleets by that time as well, by 2030. So what we understand is that leading countries are, adopting this type of public transit electric bus mandates, and Indonesia could be adopting something similar, pushing, providing some regulatory base to these goals, and that can be also extended to taxis and other government fleets can benefit from that. And the last one is the adoption of innovative business models. And in that case, these are now open for electric charger and battery swapping stations. This is all under the regulation of the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources. So that is very positive. What is not clear is the innovative business models for the bus as a for bus services, and that is something that my colleague Revi Petagradia will be explaining a little bit later today. So let's go forward in the light of considering the time limitations. Let's just stop here 1 second, just comparing the current direct incentives that are provided from China, India, California. They are very strong coming from the government. The range goes from $69,000 to $80,000 that are given per bus. Electric bus can range from $120,000 to $150,000, so they can cover 40 to 60% of the price of the bus. Some of those incentives have been reduced now that the batteries are coming down. The price of the batteries are coming down, and that provides some reduction in the fiscal load to the government. But this is one of the approaches in terms of direct incentives. Let's go to the next one. So the recommendation that we have is strong direct incentives for consumers, especially for public transportation. Also stronger fiscal incentives in terms of the transfer fees that can be increased and harmonized across provinces, and to pay for these incentives through vehicle carbon associated taxes. That could be one option, as well as the consideration of carbon taxation and the cap and trade program that is being right now discussed at the national level in Indonesia. So this could be one of the channels of that funding, the funding of electric vehicles for public fleets. Let's go to the next slide. I think I will have to skip some of those. Let's go to the next one. We'll skip this one on indirect incentives. Let's go forward. Let's go one more. Let's skip in the infrastructure development as well. Let's skip this one. Yeah, I wanted just to stop here in public mandates. The idea is to electrification of these bus fleets can be accelerated through electric vehicle mandates quotas that has been adopted in China, California, Colombia, and Chile, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, providing a clear, amount, the share of new buses and a timeline between, like in Colombia, 2025 and 2035. So it's a 10-year time frame to execute the transition. And in Indonesia, we are very lucky that there is an indication of interest towards that goal. The Ministry of Transport has expressed the goal of 90% of electrification of public transit fleet by 2030. And at the local level, the government has adopted mandatory battery electric vehicle purchase by government institutions. So there are some signals that point towards that. And I think one of the main recommendations, if we go to the next one, please, will be for Indonesia to focus on developing a public fleet vehicle mandate that will focus on public transit fleets and government vehicles. And public transit covers buses as well as taxis. And this is designed along the ways of how China, California, Colombia, and Chile have been doing it. It will also provide a strong signals to electric vehicle manufacturers on the demand of electric vehicles in Indonesia, and will also align with the electric vehicle industrial policy. The drive for electrification in Indonesia is the focus is industrial development, and that is what PR 55 2019 presents. So having this type of mandates will send a clear signal that this is that investors can invest and reduce the risk of that investment and bring the investment in terms of manufacturing of these vehicles in the country. Let's go to the next one. The innovative business models, which is a very interesting topic, a lot of debate behind this. In Latin American countries, especially Santiago and Bogota, have been leading this. The idea is to split the business service, the bus service into two different key actors, the bus operator and the fleet provider, and that sort of the split of asset ownership and operations to reduce the risk to the investment. And this is something that we can, explored in detail by my colleagues, and we explored them in this technical exercise in terms of how can that look in the future for Indonesia as one option to to reduce the cost to the government and to accelerate the adoption of electric buses in the country. Let's go to the next one, which is the recommendations. So one of the key challenges that we identify for business models for electric buses in Indonesia is that the contract period is extremely short. Very recently, we learned that Transjakarta has adopted a 10-year contract for bus operation, which is a step in the right direction. Most cities, a 3-year contract is common. Ideally, a 15-year contract will be the best solution because it will cover the battery replacement typically happen at the 7th or 8th year. So that will be the best time period to cover the bus itself plus the replacement of the battery by the 8th year. Another recommendation would be extending the Ministry of Transport by the service program for bus operators that are deploying electric buses beyond the currently planned 3 years, which is the current plan for the by the service. Just make it a little bit longer to support and incentivize, and also can be a conduit. The by the service can become the conduit for these direct incentives. And again, the adoption of the split models is for discussion. There is a lot of capacity building that should happen before implementation, but my colleague is going to be presenting that. So the last slide, just the final recommendations, please, and I will be finalizing. First, strong monetary incentives for electrification, especially for bus transit systems. We can use the by the service program for that. Stronger fiscal incentives. I feel that the transfer fee is not enough to make a difference with respect to the internal combustion engine vehicles. A wider adoption of indirect incentives like low emission zones. We didn't discuss that for time, but it's all in the report. So please read the report. Electrification mandate for buses, very important to reduce the risk of investments, as well as operators. If everybody's in the same page, the investments will happen and companies will bring and produce these vehicles in the country. And revise the contracting practices to extend the contract periods for battery electric buses, especially between 14 and 15 years. That would be a sweet spot. And the possibility of adoption of split business models for public transit buses. Well, that's all, and thank you very much for your time. And I'm happy to answer questions later during the panel.
Thank you very much, Mr. Francisco Posada. Thank you, likewise. Thank you for the presentation. And next, ladies and gentlemen, we will continue to our second presentation from our second speaker, where we have Mr. Adi Triatmojo. Mr. Adi Triatmojo is a research consultant for the heavy duty vehicles team in Indonesia. He works on policy development on bus electrification and soot-free promotion actions in the heavy duty vehicle sector. His works also include zero emission bus deployments in Indonesia, data collection and emission modeling for South Africa, and stakeholder engagement in ASEAN for regional transition to Euro 6 standards and cleaner fuels. Before joining ICCT, Mr. Triatmojo worked for Coaction Indonesia, GIZ, and Waste to Energy developers. He has co-authored several articles and also research publications and given technical assistance for Indonesia's bioenergy industry, climate mitigation, and the sustainable transport sector. Mr. Triatmojo holds a Bachelor of Engineering from Institut Teknologi 10 November in Indonesia with a focus on environmental engineering. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Adi Triatmojo. And Mr. Adi Triatmojo, your allocated presentation time is 15 minutes. The time and screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Saraway.
Yes, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Adi Triatmojo. I'm a research consultant from ICCT. In this occasion, I would like to present our findings about the environmental impact analysis in Greater Bandung and Greater Medan. For the coverage and assumption that we use, for technical analysis coverage, it includes environmental impact for the use of the BRT in Greater Bandung and Greater Medan, and we assess also the local impact. We use a time frame for the global warming and potential of the reduction of the pollutant from the TPP emission that can give impact to the human being, like NOx, particulate matter, and carbon dioxide. We also compare the emission that is produced by buses. We use 3 scenarios: electrification, diesel bus, and partial electrification. For diesel bus, the diesel bus has already meet the Euro 4 standard and use the 30% of biodiesel. Next slide. We use methodology. Okay, this one. For the methodology, we use the methodology that ICCTB developed, which is turbo. So for the greenhouse gas emission can be calculated with 2 steps. First, that direct emission from the combustion of the fuel, like from internal combustion engine, and number 2, emission that relates to the production of fuel and electricity. So emission from the emission of the upstream, downstream is called the emission module, and then we can get the greenhouse gas effect that cover life cycle and the battery used by the bus. Meanwhile, for local emission and for the pollutant of the gas produced, and this pollutant is taken from emission factor for a transport database or HPFA. So in general, the emission is a result of the emission of the type of the vehicles, which depends on the technology and the emission standard of the bus used. And there is also the vehicle kilometer travel and the number of bus in each fleet. Next slide. When we talk about electricity bus, we have to calculate also the emission of the upstream sector. And with that, we need to calculate the intensity of the carbon for the electricity bus. And next, the data that we got from RUPTL PLN in 2021, while the portion of the renewable energy in the energy mix of the plant will increase 3.4, which is supported by hydro, geothermal, solar panel, and wind. And for fossil-based electricity, will grow 1.3 times, and this fossil will be dominated by the coal-based power plant, and others will be the same. Next slide. Having known the data about the national power plant in Indonesia, we can calculate the intensive carbon that is produced by the power plant. For Medan, we use intensity of the carbon of the national level, and for Bandung, we use carbon intensity of the power plant in Jamali or Jawa Madura Bali. For Medan, we do not use intensity of carbon in the Sumatra level because there is the percentage of the mixture of the energy, which is renewable energy, is quite fluctuative. For example, in 2025, there's an increase of 70% from 27% in 2024 for about 44% in 2025. Therefore, for Medan, we use the mixture data of the national power plant and with the scenario of low carbon emission or low carbon scenario to calculate the emission that is more conservative. Next slide. Next is the calculation of greenhouse gas produced by Bandung, Greater Bandung. We can see on the right side, this is the use of the e-bus can reduce the GEG significantly. So the fleet will produce for about 23,000 tons of CO2 equivalent per year emission in 2025. And we can see there that for the electrification, partial electrification scenario with a portion 51 diesel and 103 electricity bus will produce 11,900 tons per year, which means that there is the reduction for about half of them, for about 48% compared to the use of the diesel fuel for about 100%. So the electrification scenario will produce for about 9,800 tons per year, or reduction for about 57%. And if compare with the scenario of diesel bus, and the calculation of this emission is using the assumption of the energy mixture in Jawa, Madura, and Bali power plant, with the highest presentation is about 60% of renewable energy in 2030. Next slide. Next, this is the scenario used in the Greater Bandung and in Medan Raya, in Greater Medan. If all are the diesel bus, it will produce emission for about 36,000 tons annually, and the partial with the composition 97% diesel bus and 271 electricity bus, it will produce emission for about 33,000 tons per year, when there is the reduction for about 47% of the GEG if compared with the diesel, scenario of 100% diesel bus. And also with the scenario of the electricity bus, it will produce 30,000 tons per year, or a reduction for about 63%. And this is used in the national level, and with the highest presentation is about 25% for renewable energy in 2030. Next slide. And then for the calculation of local pollutant from the emission in Greater Bandung, for Bandung, the benefit of the NOx or perimeter hydrocarbon and carbon dioxide per year, we can see that in the paragraph on the right side. So the use of 199 diesel bus with the Euro 4 standard will produce NOx for about 1,764 tons and 11.2 ton, and hydrocarbon and hydrocarbon 5.8 tons, and CO is 571 tons. Electric buses can offer 72% reduction under a partial electrification scenario, and since the bus do not provide emission in the 100% scenario, so the emission of the gas is reduced as well. Next slide. For Medan, the benefit of the reduction of NOx, particulate matter, and hydrocarbon and CO2, and the use of 368 diesel Euro 4 buses will result in tailpipe pollution emissions is NOx 3,700 tons, PM 23.6 tons, HC 12.1 tons, and CO is 1,198 tons. And the partial scenario will reduce the local pollutant for about 74%. And of course, it will be 100% if it is electrification for all fleet. So the reduction is relatively higher rather than Greater Bandung, because we have 25% for Greater Bandung. For the conclusion, for adoption of electric bus would provide cumulative GHG emission reduction between 2023 to 2040 for each city, Greater Bandung, for about 223,000 tons for full electrification, and 187,000 tons for partial electrification, while for Greater Medan, 665,000 tons for full electrification, or 498,000 tons for partial electrification. For GHG reduction, depend on the electricity carbon content, which is in the power plant sector, and the decrease of the increased GHG benefits could be achieved if the percentage of renewable generation increase beyond the planned 16% in Java and in the national level. And last is the tailpipe emission, achieve the greatest benefit, 100%, under a full electrification plan in all fleet, either in Greater Bandung or in Greater Medan, while for partial electrification can produce for about 72% of tailpipe emission for Greater Bandung, and for Greater Medan, 74% tailpipe emission. Okay, that's all from me. Sarah, thank you very much. Maybe we can have a discussion later, or any question can be put in the chat box. Thank you, Bapak Adi Triatmojo, for your presentation.
We will continue with our third speaker for today, for our third presentation. And our next speaker is Mr. Revi Petra Gradia. Mr. Revi Petra Gradia is ITDP's National Finance Specialist for e-mobility adoption strategies for the Indonesian Mass Transit Program, and he has extensive experience in infrastructure project development. During the last 10 years, he has been mainly working with international development agencies and donors, and he is currently working as a professional consultant through his consultancy company called PT Bentala Infrastruktur Dikdaya, and his fields of expertise include project financing, toll road, urban transport, and also road safety. He obtained a master's degree on highway engineering and developments on bachelor's degree in civil engineering from the Bandung Institute of Technology. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Revi Petra Gradia. Mr. Refi Petragardia, the time and screen is yours, and I would like to kindly remind you that your allocated time is 40 minutes.
Okay, thank you Sarah for the introduction. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for the time provided. And today I will be explaining about the business model and the result of the financial analysis from the implementation of electric bus in Greater Bandung and Greater Medan. Next slide. This is the outline that I will be discussing. There are 5 discussions. First is about lesson learned from the business model that has been implemented in several countries and in Jakarta, and including also the service that has been implemented by the Ministry of Transportation. And the second is the business model that is already ongoing in Bandung or in Medan. And 3 is about proposed business models in terms of the implementation of the e-bus, and number 4, recommended business models for e-bus deployment, and last is about financial analysis result. Next slide.
Yeah, next slide. Okay, lesson learned. Yeah, jadi mungkin saya sedikit merangkum dari.
I just would like to summarize from the previous workshops, as mentioned by Francisco earlier. There are several workshops conducted in several countries. There are 3 countries, and one of which is Transjakarta, which is used as the benchmark. First in Santiago, Chile, where the business model is they did splitting contract between bus and the operational of the bus itself. In Santiago, there is the utility company which provides and leases the electric buses to bus operators. So bus operators just focus in the implementing the operation. And for the contract, they use the PPP model, where duration of the contract is for about 14 years. And for model in Shenzhen, China, we agree that, of course, in China, for mobilization of electric bus is quite high, and it uses like about 16,000 until now, and the government provide incentives in terms of the subsidy or other model of incentive that can move the electric bus industry there. The business model is approximately the same with Chile, quite similar with Chile, which is the contract between fleet ownership and with the operation. However, in China, even in the bus, they split the contract again. There is a company that provides the battery. So, of course, there is a lot of actors that are involved in this business model. For the period of the contract until for about 8 years, why it is 8 years? Because it relates with the software of the battery of the bus, and apparently in China, they give the life cycle until 8 years. Third lesson learned is from Singapore. In Singapore, for the model is that they use bus contracting models, BCM, and the government owned the buses, infrastructure, operational asset, while the operators just run the business operation management and maintenance. For Jakarta, we all understand that the model that we use is the service contract model, or by the service model. For each kilometer, we'll contract include fleet operation maintenance and depot provision, where later on, the tariff will be collected by Transjakarta, and the contract is for about 10 years. Next slide. This is for the by the service model, which is conducted by the Ministry of Transportation based on the Ministry of Transportation Decree number 9/2020. By the service is the subsidiary scheme to buy selected route services in the corridor in the existing BRT corridors, which is available in the cities, and it is by the service contract is done with the operators. So for the BTS, it includes the procurement of the bus, operation and maintenance, and the depot. All cost components are the basis to determine the rupiah per IDR per kilometer. In the BTS scheme itself, the Ministry of Transportation also conduct a procurement for the management company, where the management company has a function to do the monitoring about the service or performance for the bus operators, where the output will provide recommendation to the Ministry of Transportation for the payment of by the service. So with this concept, all actors or all the stakeholders collaborate one to another. In terms of the BTS, for the implementation of the corridor route, it is implemented by the regional government, and for the preparation of the infrastructure, it is also implemented by the regional government. Meanwhile, for the Ministry of Transportation, it is more by the service payment. And based on the regulation, the existing regulation, because BTS is procured based on the regulation, which is according to the presidential decree number 16/2018 JO 12/2021. So ministerial decree 93/2020, that the contract of BTS is until for about 3 years. Well, based on the discussion from the 3-year contract, if the performance of the bus operator is according to what is expected, there is possibility to be amended or to be prolonged. Next slide. This is the current business model in Greater Bandung and Greater Medan. And this is just a kind of description. This is the business model in Bandung City, where currently Bandung, through Transmetro Bandung, has already implemented business model for the implementation of BRT. For this business model, Bandung City, through Ministry of Office of Transportation, owns gas or has a role to prepare the planning and the regulation of the tariff, and also the traffic management. Under the Office of Transportation, there is the UPT of Transportation, which is under the Ministry of Transportation. The function is to provide maintenance of the infrastructure of the bus, and it will perform monitoring for the performance of the operator and share management with the operator, and also collect the tariff, which is paid by the customers. While for the operator itself, they will be responsible for the operation and the maintenance of the bus. And for the payment, it is conducted similar with the model adapted by other BRT, which is IDR per kilometer, and the contract is for 3 years, based on our discussion in Bandung City. Next slide. Next slide. This is the BTS model, which is currently being prepared for West Java province. In general, I have already explained earlier that in terms of the concept of business model by the service, for BTS in West Java, we are doing the procurement process. And the plan is there will be several corridors that will be served by BTS, and we will do the working contract between Ministry of Transportation and the existing operators. For the concept, approximately the same as I explained. Later on, For the BTS, there will be the MOU between Ministry of Transportation and the provincial government and city government, because in terms of service, for the corridors prepared, it covered the service of the province or intercity service. So MOU is needed. So based on the discussion, the tariff is still free of charge, because based on the discussion done with the Ministry of Transportation, currently it is being discussed about the mechanism of the tariff. Next slide. This is for BTS, which is quite similar. This BTS is located in several cities, and one of which is the coverage is the province, while the BTS is the city coverage. So for Transmetro Delhi in Medan City, approximately the same with the previous model, but the implementer is Medan City. So for the MOU concept, it is the same. So it is done by the Ministry of Transportation, the provincial government of North Sumatra, and city government of Medan. So BTS has been implemented since 2020, where in 2020, the existing operator is PT Medan Bus Transport, and the Ministry of Transportation has a contract also with PT Surveyor Indonesia as the managing company, who will do the monitoring and about the implementation of the operator. And in 2021, we are conducting BTS project. And for right now, BTS project in Medan is still free. It is free of charge in Medan, because according to the information, based on the discussion that I had, the policy of the tariff is still being discussed.
This is the business model currently used in Transmedan, covering the province level. At the moment, we have 2 corridors, Medan Binjai and Medan Delhi, and the total is 4 city buses. And the policies adopted here is the policy issued in 2014-2015. At the moment, the Ministry of Transport has a policy to provide grants in a form of buses to several cities, for example, cities in North Sumatra. And by using these grants, the province appointed Damri to manage the services of the fleet. The maintenance is provided by the district or cities. They are responsible for providing shelter. While for the province level, they also in charge of all licensings. This type of business model has been implemented for quite a while in North Sumatra province. Next slide. Next, I would like to share with you our proposed business model. To start, we probably need to discuss a little bit about the institutional arrangement that we identify. We define these to identify the business model. This is the first institutional structure. The person in charge or the level of coverage is at province level. In this case, West Java and North Sumatra. And we all understand that in West Java and North Sumatra, we already have the governor regulation to form the management unit. For example, in North Sumatra, we have the institutions that coordinate cross-border areas for Mebidangro, while we have BBMA for Greater Bandung. This will cover the metropolitan city. Then the province level, since they have the authority, the province will appoint the transportation agency at province level to enter into a contract with bus operators. The cooperation unit is in charge of monitoring and carrying out consultations during the implementation. Under this concept, the district and cities can also contribute to providing the bus infrastructures. Therefore, collaboration between the province level and also the district and cities is very important to provide the required infrastructure. In this institutional structure, the Ministry of Transport can also provide support or grants for infrastructure development because we know it is important and it is necessary for us to have the adequate infrastructure to support the implementation of the e-bus implementation. And this is the second type of institutional structure. The implementation is different compared to the first one. Through the regional owned enterprises, they will enter into a contract with the bus operators. The regionally owned enterprises is playing a great role, and this is positive for the business because if the business is good or the coverage is good, the regional owned enterprises actually has the flexibility in terms of the financing. They can have financing from lenders, banks, or using state bonds. Under regulations, Presidential Regulation number 54, Government Regulation number 54, to establish ROD, there are two requirements. First is 100% owned by the provincial government. Another form of ROE is in a form of perseroda, with 51% of equity owned by provincial government, while the remaining equity, 49%, is owned by the municipalities or the public. In our opinion, the second institutional structure here provides us with flexibility in terms of the financing. We have four parameters or rationales why we need to engage with the private sectors in adopting e-mobility. First is creating fiscal capacity. The price of electric bus at the moment is still quite high based on our market research. It's almost twice as expensive as the diesel buses. Therefore, if we are using a traditional concept through operators and also governments, there will be challenges for the government to provide subsidy or to pay the services to the operators. Therefore, by involving private sectors, we can actually reduce the fiscal capacity through several business models. The second rationale is the private sector can bring efficiency and cost effectiveness in e-bus businesses. The private sector also has the capacity in the adoption of technology. Some businesses in private sectors are more efficient, transparent, and effective. We hope that through engagement with private sector, it will bring efficiency, effectiveness, and also proven technology. And as mentioned by Francisco before, we can also implement a split model. We separate the provision of the buses and the operations of the buses. Through this, we hope that there is a flexibility for the private sectors in implementing e-mobility in urban areas. And lastly, we also understand that e-mobility needs government support. Even though we involve private sectors, the support from the government are still needed. Next slide. The following are several business model options. We have 5 business models here. The first model is a PPP model. Payment is through tariff. And the second model is through IP or availability payment. And 3A, B, C, and 3D, E, F. These are non-PPP model, but it is similar to the model that we implement with Jakarta using ROE. The contracting agency would be the provincial government with the availability payment. That's the slight difference. And then lastly here we are using BTS model, and the service is provided by the Ministry of Transport. The difference is in terms of the contracting agency and also the duration of the contract. For PPP model, the contract can be more than 10 years in accordance with the prevailing regulation. PPP contract may be extended to more than 10 years. For the model of ABCDF, in line with the model implemented by Transjakarta, the duration of contract is about 10 years. And then for BTS model, the duration of contract is 3 years, with an option to extend the contract period. And in this slide, I probably would not describe all these models, but based on our analysis and discussion, the model that is suitable for North Sumatra and also West Java, considering the contracting agency through ROE, is the best or most sensible and reliable model, which is model 3A. This is a bundling model. In bundling model, the contract between the ROE and operators covers the provision of buses, operations and maintenance, and also depot facilities. This contract will be applicable for 10 years. And through service payment, the provincial government will also implement a model that is similar to the model in Transjakarta, because we understand that for public transportation, we must consider the tariff. Therefore, the supports or PSO or subsidy is still necessary to be provided by the government. First, the operators may make available the charging stations, and they will be in touch with PLN in terms of the electricity payment. And there will be another company for providing the charging stations. The ROE will enter into charging contract services with a charging provider. And then next, for other model, the bus operator will enter into the contract with the service contract with the charging provider. In this model 3A, government will also need to provide fiscal incentive to the regions. For example, by carrying out feasibility studies or support in the construction stage, the national government can help regarding those issues. For this slide, I will not elaborate in detail. These slides elaborates the roles of each stakeholders in terms of the models of 3A, 3B, and 3C. This is a split model. As for the bus fleet, ROE or the provincial government, the operators will with the previous model is quite significant for the procurement of charging stations, more or less the same, and it's also similar to DF model. Through model 3B, we hope that the operators will have reduced risks for asset maintenance. However, the issue is the ROE and provincial government must have the capacity to provide the bus fleet. That is the challenge if we implement model 3B. This is the comparison of each model. You can review this later. Let's skip this. For charging infrastructure business model, as I mentioned before, we have two options. First, the bus operator will provide the charging infrastructure. The bus operators will enter into a contract with bus provider. The bus operator will enter into a contract with PLN for the purchase of electricity. For the second option, the bus operator do not provide the charging infrastructure, but there will be another party, which is the charging provider, that will provide the charging station. The bus operator will enter into a contract with bus provider, but the operator will also have a contract with charging provider in order to have the charging infrastructure available. And this is the summary and recommendations. These recommendations based on our review. First, regarding the business model, service payment model is probably the most suitable one for Greater Bandung and Greater Medan. The minimum 10-year duration of contract would be the most ideal minimum contract duration. The ROE will be the most efficient contracting agency that will enter into a contract with the bus operators because they will have the flexibility for financing aspects. The ROE can also collect the fees directly. ROE, however, will face a challenge, for example, in terms of incorporating a new ROE. There will be a risk that we may face to establish a new ROE. Therefore, we also recommend that we occupy the existing ROEs in West Java and North Sumatra. In North Sumatra, we have PT Pembangunan Sarana Pramata Utara and their core business is the management in the Toba Lake. I believe they are able to expand the scope of business. In West Java, we have PT Jasa Sarana. PT Jasa Sarana at the moment is providing infrastructures for transportation sectors, water supply sectors, and also waste management sectors. We identify a opportunity for Jasa Sarana to expand the scope of business to include this sector. We also would like to recommend that ROE can collect the tariff directly through farebox or non-farebox schemes, and ROE can work together with the payment collection service provided by banks for cashless transaction. And as mentioned by Francisco before, e-bus contract ideally is 15 years in duration. And I think it is most feasible by using PPP scheme. This can be our option to adopt this business model because through PPP scheme, we have several features or facilities that can be accessed by the provincial government or the ROE. For example, VGF provided by the Ministry of Finance or guarantee from the Indonesian Guarantee Fund. Incentives and subsidy are still needed from the government to support the adoption of e-mobility in the future. In the future, it is possible for us to dig the potentials of operations business if in Indonesia we have a high number of public bus fleet. In accordance with the Ministry of Energy Energy and Mineral Resources, we may have an opportunity to explore the business for charging stations. And the next slide is about our financial analysis for adopting e-mobility in Greater Bandung and Greater Medan. We have several scenarios: full electrification and partial electrification. And we also compare bundling model and unbundling model. For bundling model, we are using tariff plus PPP, but we also have another model, tariff plus IP or service payment. We also develop the scenario for unbundling model. We also consider whether the operator provide their own charging station or work together with a charging provider. We also consider the availability of VGF from the government in the amount of 49% of the capex. This VGF may be feasible, especially if we are using PPP model. I think this is under the authority of Ministry of Finance. However, other types of fiscal incentives may be under the authority of other institutions such as the Ministry of Transport. And this is our financial analysis in Greater Bandung. We have discussed in this workshop starting yesterday regarding bus deployment for full electrification and partial electrification. In West Java, we have around 225 electric buses in 3 phases. For the pilot, we have about 19 electric bus piloted in 2023, and then the rest will be implemented at the second phase and the third phase in 2024 and 2025. For partial electrification in Bandung or West Java, in total we will have 2 operators based on our analysis. And then we run the financial models for these 2 operators. This slide tells us about the charger deployment. For full electrification, we will have in total 106 chargers, including depot charger and terminal chargers. For partial electrification strategy, we have 74 charger deployment, both depot and terminal charger. This slide is describing about the demand and fair revenue. The demand analysis by World Bank has been carried out, and also revenue analysis has been carried out by GIZ. And we consider the results in considering this financial model, and we use a flat tariff of 6,000 rupiah that reflect the average fare for passenger. And this will support the increase of traffic volume in line with the level of ownership of the fleet. The flat should be the fare should be flat, or the tariff should be flat for 10 years. And other revenues may be collected from advertisement or other revenues in amount of about 5%. We have identified the potential revenue at the first year about $1 million until about $17 million by the 10th year. And this slide shows us the service payment for full electrification and partial electrification. We also calculate this by considering the bundling and also unbundling model. For the bundling model, the total is more or less 27 million US dollar, or about 400 billion rupiah. For partial, we have around 24 million US dollar. If we consider the capex, we probably will see a decrease of capex considering this calculation. For the unbundling model, we need about 13 million US dollar for full electrification, and for partial electrification, we need about 11 million US dollar. This will give an overview of service payment that is required by the West Java government. There is a potential of revenue that can be collected by the province of West Java. Therefore, the deficit is still quite reasonable for the government of West Java to deploy the e-buses. There is only 5 minutes left, sir. Okay, thank you. I will share with you the financial analysis for the Greater Medan area. It's more or less the same in terms of the bus deployment. In Medan, the e-buses, we will have around 300 buses. For partial electrification, we have about 312 buses. And actually, yesterday we have discussed the numbers of the buses. And we plan for a pilot in 2023, phase 1 in 2024, and phase 2 in 2025. The detail in terms of the total number of e-buses can be seen in this table. As for the charger deployment, I will go straight into the total. There's about 187 charging stations for full electrification, while for partial electrification, we have 138 charging stations. As for the demand and fare revenue, analyzing the study conducted by the World Bank, in the 11 routes we have analyzed the tariff, and based on the analysis, the tariff is about 4,500 rupiah per passenger. It is different from the fare in the previous city. And the non-revenue income could be about 5%. In the first year, the total revenue is up to 2.9 million US dollar, and by the 10th year, it's about 22 million US dollar for the potential of revenues, considering the current demand. And lastly, the calculation of service payment for each operator. We can observe the numbers here. For bundling model, we consider that we need 162 million US dollar for full electrification, and it needs about almost 1 trillion rupiah per year. For partial electrification, we have also quite a big amount of money. Why it is still quite high in terms of the value? Because we still need to have a bigger fleet of e-buses. We also consider VGF as a fiscal support. If we have VGF, the service payment will decrease to about 46 million US dollar. For unbundling model, the service payment will decrease by a third to 29 million US dollar. For partial electrification, it's about 24 million US dollar. But the problem is the provincial government must invest in advance for the purchase of all the e-buses and provide the e-buses for the operators. The operators will only focus on the O&M. However, considering the potential of revenues, each year the service payment may be offset by the potential revenue. And this is the conclusion of our discussion. Based on financial analysis that we conducted, NPV would be negative for all local governments. This means the local government will invest in the infrastructures, provide subsidies and other supports. And in conclusion, the BRT system should be non-profit business. From the perspective of operators, this would be beneficial if we are using availability payment scheme under PPP scheme or ROE service payment, because the service payment will also include the operation parameter and also the profit margin. By using this model, the IRR for operators is still quite high. We also have calculated the fiscal capacity at the high level, especially in North Sumatra and West Java. For West Java, up to 2020, the fiscal capacity is about 1,000 to 1,100 trillion rupiah. and these would allow service payment or subsidy for the operators. However, of course, this will need further analysis. We cannot just use the surplus of the fund to provide fiscal incentives or subsidy. In North Sumatra, the issue is North Sumatra do not have any surplus as big as the surplus in as big as the surplus in West Java. North Sumatra only has about 300 to 500 billion Indonesian rupiah annually. Therefore, one of the options that can be used for North Sumatra is the provision of VGF or to implement partial electrification scenario. Based on this study, in terms of the roadmap for adopting mobility, of course, we will need further analysis, for example, how we can calculate the to calculate the non-fare box, the potential revenue, and we also need to consider TOD. I think that's all that I would like to share here in terms of the financial analysis results. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to write it down in the chat or ask me directly. Thank you.
Thank you, Pak Revi, for your presentation and for the materials. Thank you, Mr. Revi.
Has come to an end. We will start the panel discussion with the speakers, and the panel discussion for today will be moderated by Ms. Faila Sufa. So without further ado, Ms. Faila Sufa, the time and screen is yours.
Thank you, Sarah. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This time, I will be becoming the moderator for the discussion session or panel discussion in the second day. And we will be discussing about the policy and institutional and business model for electrification of BRT in Medan, in Greater Medan and in Greater Bandung. And with that, I would like to invite all panelists, Mr. Suharto, Mr. Hasrul, Mr. Sismadi, and Mr. Ihsan to switch on your video. The discussion panel will be attended by 4 panelists. First is Mr. Suharto from Ministry of Transportation, Director of Road Transport, and Mr. Hasrul from Ministry of Finance. He is Head of Section of Project Preparation Sector 4, and Mr. Sismadi from Bapeda, West Java. He is Head of Regional Infrastructure Division of Bapeda, West Java, and Mr. Ihsan Ashari. He is Head of Transportation Division of Bapeda of North Sumatra. We are still waiting for Mr. Suharto. While waiting for Mr. Suharto from the Ministry of Transportation, my first question is dedicated to Mr. Hasrul. We have discussed deeply. Mr. Revi has already discussed about this in the previous presentation. I would like to ask you about the capacity of regional fiscal. Based on the fiscal analysis, actually, it is possible if we have fiscal support, either from Ministry of Transportation, or in this case, is from the Ministry of Finance. As have been explained earlier with the VGF model, because we see that this matter can help reducing the front cost or capex of the procurement of the electricity bus. Question for Mr. Hasro: is it possible to be done by the central ministry? In this case, is the Ministry of Finance to provide support, to provide fiscal support. Thank you, Ibu Faila. Thank you for the opportunity. Good afternoon. Thank you for the panelists. And thank you very much for all the presentations. I would like to respond directly to the question. In terms of the role of the Ministry of Finance in the development of infrastructure in Indonesia, as mentioned by Ibu Faila, one of which is that we provide fiscal support. And in the yesterday's session, there was also a presentation about the existing fiscal support for electricity-based vehicles as regulated by Presidential Decree 55/2019. And there is also support, fiscal support from taxation. If a project of procurement of mass transportation infrastructure is done with PPP scheme, Ministry of Finance has provided fiscal support, including VGF. VGF is eligible for transportation sector, where in principle it provides services to the community, especially transportation services. And PGV, as you said, that it can reduce the burden of investment in the beginning, so people use the bus in a more affordable way. And this is the aim in the SDG, which provides the affordable urban transport for the community. In this occasion, Ibu Faila, I'd like to share our ideas to our participants and to our panelists. Government support through Ministry of Finance is not through VGF only. If an infrastructure project for mass transportation is done by involving private sector, we can also provide fiscal incentive or support in terms of the supply. It has been discussed in the presentation from our fellow speakers, from Francisco, for example. Initially, he explained in very detail, and it was elaborated by Refi. Let's say it is involving private sector. We need to create an environment where our engagement with bus provider is possible to make a long-term contract. So the investment is long-term. So minimum, the cycle of the contract is the same with the life cycle of the bus. So the contractor or the bus provider can depreciate all the procurement of the bus costs. So it will be easier. With a longer-term contract, the company that becomes the bus provider can be more confident to get financing, long-term financing. As we all know, that long-term financing in certain reason is more efficient. This is one thing that we need to consider as this form of support as well. And with that, the Indonesian government has what we call SDG Indonesia 1. So where the Ministry of Finance together with PTSMI, have the program Indonesia 1, where they will facilitate contractors or SPV or whatever it is. So they are able to get financing from donors, for example, or to investors. In Indonesia SDG 1, there are 4 pillars that can be explored. First is development, project development, and number 2 is risking, third is financing, fourth is equity. So this can be considered. So I envision, let's say, the example is the business model that is described by Refi. So the one who should be the coordinator if BM is the regional owned enterprises, and they will have a contract with several bus providers. So bus provider can use the facility like mentioned in the SDG 1, Indonesia SDG 1, because this project relates closely with one goal in SDG, one of which I mentioned earlier. So with that access, it is hoped that we can have the cheap source, low-cost source, and the investment should be long-term. So the charge that is applied by the service will be more efficient, plus VGF. So we see it in a more holistic way. They have VGF, and in terms of finance, we are able also to assign that. So I think that's all my answer, Ibu Faila. Maybe next we will be able to elaborate it. I would like to elaborate with Mr. Suharto. Pak Suharto, have you joined us? Okay. So it is mentioned in the presentation that currently the contract of the bus service with operator is only 3 years with the gross cost contract, rupiah per kilometer. And Mr. Hasrul also responded it well that, okay, maybe it has the period of the contract should be prolonged. What is the response from the Ministry of Transportation? Because there is the relation with the Ministry of Finance. Based on the calculation and based on the benchmark of other countries, even in Transjakarta, the period of the contract can be prolonged. So let's say if we plan for about 3 years and then it is prolonged for about 3 years and then it will be prolonged again 3 years afterwards, the economical value will be impacted to the cost of the rupiah per kilometer. The cost will be higher. So maybe Ministry of Transportation can help to accelerate this. Any response from Mr. Suharto? Okay, thank you, Ibu Faila. What has been mentioned by all the source persons, actually we realized that all operators have often met with me. They would like to participate because the Ministry of Transportation's program is to provide BTS in several cities. And even for the event G20 that will be conducted, we will prepare 50 units of electricity bus. And of course, currently, our position, whether we are going to we rent or are we going to purchase, and which one is more efficient. But actually, either it is renting or buying, we will need more buses only for G20. So for the metropolitan city, we provide the additional electricity buses in addition to the existing BTS. In this case, is diesel. So operator mind if it is only 3 years, and minimum they would like to have 7 years. So it would be ideal if it is more than 7 years, or it will be more beneficial for them. But if it is 3 years, there is another alternative. The first 3 years, second 3 years, and third 3 years. Who can give certainty that for the next 3 years? So of course, there are these questions. So currently, we are in the effort to procure electricity vehicles. So renting electricity vehicles, we use state budget. And then the use of the state budget must follow the regulation of the Ministry of Finance, or PMK. In the PMK, we are limited because multi-year contract is only 3 years. So hope that maybe we can find a solution, because right now the position is very approaching. So Ministry of Finance probably can give the solution for this, because right now the average of the majority of the electricity bus is not produced domestically. We have to import it. So let's say if we import from overseas, the period is 3 years. So, and the TKDN is higher, then it requires a minimum 6 months. So I repeat, for imported bus, minimum built up import is minimum 3 months, and if the TKDN is higher, minimum is 6 months. And even for G20, it is ongoing. And I hope there will be a certainty, and I hope there will be flexibility as expected by providers of the BRT. Ibu Vela, that's all from me. Thank you. Thank you, Pak Suharto. So of course, there is an urgency to extend or to be more flexible for the in terms of the contract, because contract is under the PMK of multi-year contract. So what type of mechanism? I believe Ministry of Transportation and Ministry of Finance can discuss about this together, and G20 can become a momentum. So we will be able to update the regulations, and it can be also implemented in the BRT system in Metropolitan Medan and in Metropolitan Bandung. Next, we go to our gentleman from Bapeda. Currently, we realize that regional budget is still in the contraction phase due to COVID. So for fiscal condition itself, to welcome implementation of BRT in Metropolitan Medan and Bandung, in Greater Medan and Greater Bandung, what is the preparation? Can it become one of the strategic activities in each city that is prioritized? Maybe we can fight against the pandemic. So the response, Mr. Sismadi from West Java, Bapeda. Yes, ma'am. Thank you very much for the opportunity given to me. Please to introduce myself. My name is Sismadani. With your permission, I would like to represent my boss, and I would like to ask your prayer, because usually the one who is present in terms of BRT is the head of infrastructure in our region. He came to discuss yesterday, and Saturday he died, and we hope that his concern to develop mass transportation in the city, especially in Bandung, in Greater Bandung, becomes a blessing for him in the heaven. I'd like to respond about the preparation of the fiscal capacity of the West Java province. Ladies and gentlemen, there are several issues. that we are preparing in relation to the communication, especially with the Regional Representative Council in terms of the self-service payment provided in West Java province. In 2023, since this year, the process, the conversation with legislation should have been done, but since we have to follow many procedure, so the conversation will begin in 2023. Based on the presentation from Mr. Refi, we agree as our regional midterm budget, we have to include also the development project for mass transportation. In this case, is electric bus. Mr. Governor has used electric vehicle for his operational activity. So we can see that the governor participates in the movement for electric vehicles. In general, the fiscal capacity of the regional government in this case is that we just need to discuss it with executive and legislative. This is our homework, and we need to be assisted by you as well. So in terms of revenue, even though the state budget is contracted due to COVID, we think for 2022, our revenue is supported by a factor of transportation factor, and expenditure is 14.3 in our RPJMD. Our expenditure will be about 40 trillion rupiah, and I think based on the fiscal calculation, the West Java provincial government with about 180 billion, there is the option of the extension of the contract, or maybe 10 years or more. So this is our homework in how to communicate this issue with the legislation. So this is something that needs to be supported by all the experts who are present here. I think that's all from me to answer your question. Thank you, Mr. Sismadani. My deep condolences, because we just had the deputy mayor and now the head of the infrastructure, hope that he will be blessed by God Almighty. Mr. Ihsan, thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. First of all, I apologize because the head of Bapeda has another engagement, so I'm assigned to replace him. In terms of the question about fiscal capacity of North Sumatra, with the existence of COVID-19, it is the budget is contracted strongly. So if I hear the source persons, they mentioned if the EPV is negative in some assistance, so it is quite heavy. It's 1 trillion rupiah. So maybe we need what we call VGF. But in this case, I wonder, I think further, I haven't seen since then, is it possible to use the PPP scheme? Can it be done unsolicitedly? It's purely from the private sector. With the PPP that is unsolicited, we can deal with the finance issue, because I don't see any assessment. The PPP is more to be solicited. So I think, is it possible to do that? Because private sector is lighter. What happens if it is all given to the private sectors? So maybe the revenue from the private sectors will be more creative, so they can maximize the TOD and advertising. Maybe it is necessary to have additional assessment in relation to the BRT, especially electrified BRT is the transformation of the public transportation. So we need more courageous ideas because it requires a lot of fun. Meantime, the fiscal capacity can be said is not adequate. So we need some new breakthrough. So if we think that the government alone, of course, it will be the burden of the government. But if we have ideas, maybe PPP that is full private sectors, then everything can be lighter because private sectors has stronger fiscal capacities. They are more effective, transparent, and more efficient. I think that's all from me. Thank you, Ibu Faila Sufa. Thank you, Mr. Irsan. The challenge is from West Java, how is our communication between executive and legislative? In North Sumatra, probably it is quite heavy, quite burdensome if it is all becoming the burden of the government. Mr. Hasrul, I would like to come back to you. There is a VGF. Is there any other incentive? For example, we are mandated by Mr. President by Presidential Decree 55/2019 about electrification, that this is one of the government of Indonesia's programs and also in COP26. There is a plan of the is there any plan from the Ministry of Finance to help apart from, in addition to the PPP scheme, maybe you have a specific scheme to accelerate the electrification in Indonesia? Well, thank you, Ibu Faila. In terms of that question, currently, at least I haven't heard about that new scheme or specific scheme, but maybe with this workshop, we will have a discussion afterwards. If Ministry of Finance would like to provide support to encourage electrification of public transportation. However, the way we see it, encouraging electrification, especially for public transport, is not only relating to support only, but there is other supports discussed. As mentioned also by Mr. Suharto, there is a relation with the limitation of the 3-year limitation in the contract. And as Mr. Isan also said, that probably we need to involve 100% private sectors because they are more flexible in seeking funding. The way we see it, it gives signal to us that financing issue relates closely with institutional issue, as mentioned earlier. So if we see in our RPJMN or midterm national plan, there is a gap for the infrastructure funding, where some percentage should be the burden of the private sectors. So based on what Mr. Isan said, if we need to boost the participation of private sectors, then we need to create an environment that is attractive to private sectors. As mentioned in the presentation, for example, between maintenance and operational risk. So something that relates to demandless becomes the responsibility of the government, because the provision of the public transport is the obligation of the government. But maybe for operational risk, probably can be the burden of the bus provider because they have more experience. With that, I think if we try to approach this with such a scheme, so we create an environment that is attractive for private sector so they can come in. So from supply side, there will be many providers interested, and we can boost this with several incentives that I mentioned earlier. That there is incentive and the system of the financing apart from the VGF, and if it is PPP, because PPP there is the collateral issue, and it will make them easy to do the financing. And we have also SDG Indonesia 1 if they would like to provide financing to the donors, because this project in relation to SDG, from the point of view of the environment, it can reduce the gas emission significantly. So it goes to environmentally friendly project. The way we see it, we need to see it in a more holistic way. So in terms of institutional, it would be ideal, as mentioned earlier in the presentation, it is necessary to have an institution that manage in the integrated fashion, including the route and basic infrastructure. So it should be infrastructure that has the flexibility to obtain financing or funds or in doing the procurement. In addition to that, for the provision of the bus and charging station, we can design as such so the operators will be able to have a contract with bus provider or with charging system provider, where the bus provider or charging station provider are not exposed in the main risk, but they just focus on the operational risk. So there will be dominant to include in that. So we will hope that there is the private sector participation. So we will be able to boost the realization of the targets that have been mentioned in several regulation of the government. I think that's all from me.
Thank you, sir. Of course, we're also looking forward to the support from fiscal perspective, especially in the electrification sector. Allow me to ask Pak Suharto, regarding several presentations by the Ministry of Transportation and also probably a presentation by yourself, the Ministry of Transportation has a target of electrification by 90% in 2030 in all 34 provinces. Following this plan or goal, do we have any specific regulations or specific incentives that will be provided by the Ministry of Transport? For example, other countries such as Chile, India, they have a kind of specific regulations for accelerating electrification in terms of the public transportation by providing fiscal incentives. Could you elaborate on that? Okay, thank you. Of course, we will have incentives. We will support all we can. At the moment, we are also developing the local content level, for example. What percentage of local content should be required? At the moment, we have a minimum of 30%, and we need to communicate and discuss this further so that we can also provide the business sectors to conduct their business in an easier way. Currently, in metropolitan cities, under the RPJMN, has been provided with the targets by applying e-buses. For example, for the feeders buses or even mini buses, we already encourage them to use e-buses, not only the BRT system. At the moment, we have an instruction from the coordinating ministry for maritime affairs and incentives. All government agencies and ministries will provide incentives, not only the Ministry of Transport, because we are following the instruction from the president under the presidential decree. Therefore, the main coordinator, the Ministry of Coordinating uh, Maritime Affairs and Investment, will also play a great role together with other ministries. For example, with the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources, they will also think about how they can meet the target for the electricity supply. We believe that the government agencies will provide easiness of business for the private sectors. And we also work together with a lot of ministries, such as the ministries of trade as well. One of the way that we will take is at least by changing the multi-year contract duration, not limited to 3 years. By doing this, we will have a higher supply from the business sectors in terms of e-buses per efficient. If the supply is higher, I think we will be able to achieve the target. Not only the government at national level who hope that we can operate e-buses, the local governments as well, because there are so many advantages by applying e-buses. The concept of local governments actually now is already in line with the national government. Therefore, we need to focus on how we can accelerate the mass production of e-buses in Indonesia. If we are importing built up buses, then we will provide some incentives for these importers. Thank you, sir.
Mungkin saya lanjutkan ke
Now I would like to continue the discussion
bapak-bapak dari Bapeda. Ada
with
informasi
the
sedikit
representatives
karena
from
ini kan
Bapeda.
sudah
Is there
hampir
any comments or
selesai.
remarks you would like
Apakah
to
ada
make
yang ingin
before we close the discussion in the interest of time?
mungkin Pak Ihsan?
Do you have any further response, Pak Ihsan?
Baik, terima kasih. Jadi ya,
Thank you.
sambil minum air juga nih jadinya kan. Akhirnya ada statement insentif tadi ya. Kan
I am very happy to hear the statement about incentives because the local governments do need incentives. The national target is full electrification, and the local government
tambahan juga ya
is
tadi
still struggling to achieve that target. And as mentioned by Pak Suharto, to involve private sectors, they only need some assistance to make them easy to conduct their business. For example, in licensing, if we are able to provide them with this kind of easiness to conduct business, then I believe that we will have more investors coming to Indonesia in this
Terima
field.
kasih Pak
Thank you.
Ihsan.
Thank you,
Pak
Ms. Paila. Thank you,
Sismadani.
Pak Isan. Pak Sismadani, do you have any further comment? Well, final remarks from us. In general, I have mentioned before, at the moment we still need to develop the umbrella regulations or a framework for the local governments to provide integrated mass public transportation, especially for Bandung greater area. This is one of our priorities in the future to develop this umbrella framework. And then in 2023, we will disseminate this framework with the legislative to make these frameworks as a law. We already list down the types of regulations or laws that may be necessary to support e-mobility. And I think the most urgent is how we can develop the local government head regulations on the provision of integrated mass public transportation in Greater Bandung. And we also noted some inputs from today's meeting, for example, the utilization of ROE, we are currently also considering how ROE can also be appointed as the operators who will be in charge of the business plan and operations of the BRT. At the moment, we are developing the regulatory framework, and I believe, of course, in developing this regulatory framework, we will need the support from the experts. Thank you. That's all from Bapeda, West Java. Thank you, sir, for your comment. Pak Hasrul, would you like to give any comment? Thank you, Ms. Vaila, for the opportunity. I just would like to mention that the Ministry of Finance basically believe that provision of urban transportation infrastructure is very important. It is even better if we are able to implement the e-mobility concept. This will lead to a better infrastructure management that is more friendly to the environment. In this opportunity, I would like to encourage all parties in this forum to be aware of the limited budget that we have from the state budget. Therefore, we need to be creative in thinking about how we can fund the infrastructures. We cannot just rely on the government budget or only rely on one model such as PPP. We need to be creative. We need to find alternatives of models to make sure that it is efficient and also it attracts the private sectors to work together with us. And finally, to provide affordable public services for the public. That's the key. We need to think about creative financing. We need to work on this together. This is a cross-sectoral issue, not only depending on one ministry. Okay, so the keywords are innovative and creative business model and financing. Thank you, Pak Hasro. And lastly, Pak Suharto, I would like to invite you to give the closing overview. Thank you. I think our discussion these 2 days is a discussion that motivates us all to realize the implementation of e-vehicle in Indonesia. Of course, we have several challenges at the moment at operational stage, but I think we have identified these challenges well. So the question is how we can collectively work on this together to solve the challenges and implement this. I believe that we can work together and all parties can use the authority to realize the adoption of e-mobility. We are sharing the same interests, which is how we can achieve the target established by the government of Indonesia as soon as possible. This is our shared target to improve the condition of Indonesia. Thank you. Thank you, Pak Soeharto, for your comments. I think from your remark, the keyword is working together to achieve the shared goal, which is the implementation of electrification, especially in the public transportation sector. Well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, especially the speakers in the discussion panel. I would like to extend my gratitude to you all. I hope everyone is healthy, and I believe we will continue to keep in touch until the BRT system and e-buses or e-mobility in Greater Bandung and Greater Medan can be implemented. Thank you, everyone. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. May peace be upon us all.
Balik ke Sarah.
Baik, terima kasih.
Sarah, over to you. Thank you, Ms. Maila.
And ladies and gentlemen, before we wrap up the second day of our workshop, please join me in welcoming Mr. Tomas Herrero Diaz, a transport consultant of the World Bank, to deliver the closing remarks for us today. To Mr. Tomas Herrero Diaz, the time and screen is yours.
My name is Tomas Herrero, and I work as a transport consultant for the World Bank in Indonesia. And I am also co-leading the implementation of the e-mobility adoption roadmap for the Indonesia Mass Transit Program technical assignment, along with Nupur Gupta. And this technical assignment has been funded by the Mobility and Logistics or MOLO Trans Fund and the Energy Sector Management Assistance Program, or SMAP. And the World Bank hired a consortium of consultants led by the Institute for Transportation and Development Policy, or ITDP, and supported by the International Council on Clean Transportation, or ICCT, to implement this technical assignment. And this is the last session of our third virtual workshop, which is the final event of a series of capacity building actions initiated in December of the last calendar year. And as Ben mentioned yesterday, Indonesia is the world's fifth largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions, and the transport sector is one of the main contributors to these emissions. And the country needs to make additional efforts to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions and to mitigate the climate change impact and meet the nationally determined contributions established under the Paris Agreement. And to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions generated by the transport sector, Indonesia should promote the adoption of low carbon transport means, such as public transport and non-motorized transport. As Pak Suharto flagged in his opening remarks today, the RPGMN for 2020 and 2024 identified the development of mass transit systems as a key priority for Indonesia and proposed the implementation of mass transit systems in 6 Indonesian metropolitan areas, including Jakarta, Surabaya, Medan, Bandung, Makassar, and Semarang. As Nupur mentioned today, currently, the government of Indonesia, with support from the World Bank, is preparing the Indonesia Mass Transit, or MASTRAN project, to not only strengthen institutional capacity for mass transit development, but also support the implementation of BRT systems to improve urban mobility and accessibility on high priority corridors in Greater Bandung and Greater Medan. The adoption of e-mobility could also contribute to achieve greener transport outputs in Indonesia. As Paadi highlighted today, the electrification of the BRTs in Greater Bandung and Greater Medan could lead to a greenhouse gas emission reduction of up to 60% and tailpipe emission reduction of up to 100%. E-mobility in Indonesia is still in its nascent stage, but the pilots implemented by the Transjakarta and also Bluebird, and the plans to implement other pilots in Surabaya or Bandung are very encouraging signs that the country is following the right path towards urban transport decarbonization. As presented by Francisco today, the government support is crucial to close the policy gaps in Indonesia to promote the development of adequate direct and indirect incentives schemes, infrastructure development policies, public fleet electrification mandates, and innovative business models to overcome the existing barriers to mainstream e-mobility technologies into the transport ecosystem in Indonesia. As I just mentioned, the adoption of innovative business models with longer concession periods following the good practice observed in Santiago de Chile, Shenzhen, and Singapore, as suggested by Parrevi, confirmed by Pa Hasrul and Pa Suharto today, will contribute to maximize the private capital mobilized to support the provision and operation of not only e-buses, but also charging infrastructure. Under this technical assignment, the World Bank team has been working on two main work streams that both of them were presented during this third workshop. The first one was conducting a comprehensive review of the e-mobility institutional and regulatory framework of Indonesia to identify policy gaps and proposing a set of recommendations based on global good practice to bridge these policy gaps to contribute to the acceleration of the adoption of e-mobility in Indonesia, as Francisco presented today. And the second work stream is the preparation of roadmaps for the electrifications of the BRTs in Greater Bandung and Greater Medan to be supported by Mastram project, as presented yesterday by Faela and Sharada, including the grid impact assessment presented by Yanata yesterday, the environmental impact presented by Adi today, and the financial and business models presented by Barrevi yesterday and today. And the feedback that you provided during this workshop and the previous focus group discussions is very helpful for us to finalize these two technical reports. We will prepare one technical report to summarize the main findings and recommendations for each of these two work streams. We expect to have these two technical reports at the beginning of the next calendar year. I would like to take this opportunity to thank to all the workshops participants for your interest and cooperations, and in particular to Pasuharto, to Ben, and to Nupur for delivering very inspiring opening remarks yesterday and today, and to our panelists, Pa Iskandar, Pa Agustinus, Pa Bob yesterday, and Pa Suharto again, and Pa Hasrul, Pa Sismadani, and Pa Isan today, for all your valuable inputs and feedback. I would like to extend my thanks to ITDP and ICCT team for your continued support to implement this technical assignment and to deliver a number of capacity building actions, including this workshop. And last but not least, I would like to extend my thanks to Sarah for moderating this workshop. As I just mentioned, we will share the final reports with you soon to continue our dialogue on the adoption of e-mobility in Indonesia. I am very confident that this technical assignment will be helpful to inspire the government of Indonesia to embrace e-mobility to decarbonize the transport systems, starting with the new BRTs in Greater Bandung and Greater Medan. And thanks again for joining this workshop, and looking forward to continuing our dialogue to green the transport sector in Indonesia. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tomas Herrero, for the closing remarks. And yes, we're looking forward for the continuous dialogues and also cooperation and further establishing this cooperation. And ladies and gentlemen, with the closing remarks, we also have come to the end of the second and final day of the e-mobility adoption roadmap for Greater Bandung and Greater Medan Bus Rapid Transit Systems Workshop. We hope everyone had a wonderful, insightful, and most importantly, fruitful discussion. So with that, I, Sarah Wayne, thank you for your attendance and also active participation. And last but not least, I would like to wish everyone a good day and goodbye. Terima kasih dan sampai jumpa.